So welcome everybody. Welcome to our lecture in the Advanced Topics course. Today I would like to talk about the Hodrick-Prescott filter technique and would like to introduce this technique by looking at the unemployment rate of Spain. You already run into this HP filter technique lately. Because of the fact that we had a look at this paper of Lee published in the Journal of Macroeconomics, and there he's talking about the HP filter technique when it comes to Okuhn's law. Until now, we only looked at the so-called difference version of Okuhn's law, but there is also a gap version of Okuhn's law. And Lee is also estimating this gap version. Okay, in case that the term in brackets is positive, in case that the realized unemployment rate is larger than the natural rate, then the economy is in a recession. In this time period, it should be the case that the realized GDP level is smaller than the trend level, and hence beta should have a negative sign. This is what we know already, that the Okuhn coefficient beta should be negative, and this is also the case in the gap version of Okuhn's law. So when output rises above trend, when the economy is in boom, then unemployment should fall below its natural level and vice versa. So the trend of output is not directly observable, and therefore when we construct either the output gap or the unemployment gap and the natural rate, we have to make some judgment. This will become clear during this lecture. I also want to motivate this lecture by looking at one article from the Wall Street Journal. It was published in the year 2013, so when the crisis within Europe was on its peak. And here, the article says, breaking news, high European unemployment is due to recession. A new report from the European Commission suggests that the high unemployment rate in Europe is due to an economic crisis and not the result of a fundamental decline in the ability of these economies to employ their workforce. So in this article, they talk about that the high unemployment rate in Europe is not caused by a high natural rate of unemployment, but that there is a big difference between the unemployment rate realized and the natural rate, so that the unemployment gap is huge. This is what it said in this article. And they are to some extent making fun out of this kind of news, because they say breaking news. To some extent, it should be the case that this is in line with our intuition. Let's have a look at the unemployment rate in Spain before crisis in the year 2006-2007, beginning of 2008. The Spanish economy is in a boom, and the unemployment rate is relatively low when we talk about Spain. So traditionally, Spain has very high unemployment rates, so Spain is in a boom here. Then the crisis hits the Spanish economy, and the unemployment rate increases above the level of 25%, in the year 2013. This is the point in time when this article was published. So the big question is, how large is the unemployment gap? So in case that the natural rate of unemployment has not changed at all, but only the realized unemployment rate has increased, then the unemployment gap would be huge. And in this case, the Spanish government should get the allowance from Brussels to perform an expansionary fiscal policy. However, if the unemployment rate increased and the natural rate increased by the same amount, then the unemployment gap would be constant. And in this situation, the government should not be allowed to perform an expansionary fiscal policy, but should be forced to perform structural reforms of the Spanish labor market. So, whether the unemployment gap is huge or whether the unemployment gap has not changed is a very important question. And of course, there are discussions going on between Madrid and Brussels, between the capital of Spain and the EU, because the Spanish government wants to perform an expansionary fiscal policy, while Brussels is a little bit more skeptical, and they ask the question, hey, isn't it the case that the natural rate of unemployment has also increased, and therefore you should not get the allowance to perform this expansionary fiscal policy? So, a big question is, what about the natural rate? And we talked about this already to some extent in the last lecture, because we were talking about the question who joined the pool of unemployed people in Spain. It was a case that predominantly male construction workers and elderly females who were out of the labor force before, they fuel the pool of unemployed people in Spain, and therefore I would say that the natural rate of unemployment is definitely not constant, but the question emerges, by how much has the natural rate of unemployment changed? So if the blue in the next graph, we have once more a line diagram, and the blue line, this is the unemployment rate, and the orange line, this is the natural rate of unemployment. So when we measure the natural rate of unemployment like this, then there are only small gaps between the realized unemployment rate and the natural rate of unemployment. So that in 2013, the unemployment gap, the difference between the blue line and the orange line, is only minor, so that we only have a kind of 2 to 3% unemployment gap. But what if we measure the natural rate of unemployment as a straight line, as a linear trend? Then of course it is a case that in 2013 we have a huge unemployment gap, we have a huge difference between the realized unemployment rate and the natural rate. So this takes the value of about 10%. And in this situation, of course, the Spanish government should be allowed to perform an expansionary macroeconomic policy. However, in this case, it seems to be the case that the increase of the unemployment rate is predominantly caused by a change in the natural rate, so that the unemployment gap is minor. And in this case, the Spanish government should not be allowed to perform an expansionary fiscal policy, but should conduct structural reforms of its economy. So it seems to be the case that the European Commission changed the way the natural rate of unemployment was measured. Previously, before the article was written, it was a case that we used this kind of method here, and then some changes took place. The method how to measure the natural rate of unemployment changed, and suddenly it was a case that the unemployment gap is huge. And therefore, they say in this article, breaking news, high European unemployment is due to a recession. There is a huge unemployment gap. The Spanish government should be allowed to perform a counter-cyclical macroeconomic policy. So, in the following, I would like to examine and explain like how can we measure the natural rate of unemployment, and how can we measure like the unemployment gap. And here the HP filter plays a role. The basics. The idea is that in a first step, we should take the log, the natural log of the unemployment rate, and then we assume that the realized unemployment rate consists out of a trend component, tau, and a cyclical component, c. So the realized unemployment rate is equal to like the trend component, tau, and the cyclical component, c. So in this example, it is a case that the variable u, t, denotes the log of the unemployment rate. The trend component tau represents the log of the natural rate of unemployment, and the difference between the realized unemployment rate and the trend component, like the variable c, this is like the unemployment gap. So the idea is that we are looking for this kind of loss function here. We search for a trend component tau, which minimizes the following expression. Like this, when on the first look, this is a very wild equation. There are two components here, like a first component here and a second component there. Of course, like we have to go into detail and talk about like these two components here. So there are two components of the objective function, two components of the loss function. The first component will take relatively small values only if the trend component tau is relatively close to the actual time series of the log of the unemployment rate. So in case that there is only a small difference here, then this component will take relatively small values. And the second component can be interpreted as the change of the trend component. The parameter tau, which is in front of the second sum sign, represents a weighting factor and indicates which kind of weight should be given to the second component in relation to the first component. Tau is called also a smoothing parameter, because the larger tau, the more smooth will be like the trend component. So let's talk about the second component. The second component would exhibit a very low value in case that the change in the trend component is small. We have here like the change in the trend component. In an extreme scenario, the second component could even take the value of 0 when the change in tau is constant over time. This would be the case when tau changes by a constant value, say 0.02 units each quarter. I've also come up with like a numerical example. So let's assume that the variable tau takes the following values, like in period 1, tau 1 is equal to 2, in period 2, tau 2 is equal to 2.02, and in period t equal to 3, tau 3 is equal to 204. So like there is a trend, the tau parameter goes up by 0.02 values each quarter. And in this case, like the second component of the objective function would be equal to, like we are looking at like these changes here, and like the first change is equal to 0.02. The second, the first change, this is the first change. The first change is equal to 0.02. Like the second change is equal also to 0.02. So there is no change in the change of the trend. The trend is constant. The trend is constantly increasing, and therefore there is no change in the change of the trend. And hence, in this example, like the second component will be equal to 0, and the second component will not fuel like the loss function. So, like the objective function contains a kind of trade-off. The first component would take relatively small values in case that tau is adjusted relatively strongly towards ut. Then the trend component has to change frequently. However, frequent changes of tau lead to a higher penalty via the second component of the objective function, and hence there is a kind of trade-off between these two elements of the loss function. So, like, these are the basics, the theoretical basics of my lecture. So, like, in a next step, you will set up like this kind of exercise in Excel. You'll get information about the blue line. So we are downloading some data for like the Spanish unemployment gap. And then we are like approaching and using the HP filter like to iron like the blue line. When we use a very hot iron, then in the end, the natural rate of unemployment will be like a straight line. In this case, like the result will be that the unemployment gap is huge. But when we put our iron like just on like 30 degrees Celsius, then we will put not too much heat on the blue line so that we still have like some swings in the orange line. And in this case, the unemployment gap will only be minor. So like this is the idea of today's lecture. To some extent, it is related to Okun's law and the Lee paper, because here he's already talking about the HP filter, but our study like is motivated by this article published in 2013 in the Wall Street Journal, and it is about like the unemployment rate in the EU and especially like Spain. Thank you very much. Have a nice day and bye bye.